All right, G.I. Joe.
Beat 'em up, chats.
All right, guys, I'm doing a quick impressions video, kinda, I guess. I just got through playing the demo for G.I. Joe, and look, I'm just gonna be straight up with you guys. Everything that I'm gonna say in this video is stuff that I wanted to say for months on end. I was one of the beta testers at the beginning of the project, and after a while, I kind of just noped out. Uh, the last video I did on this, I was talking about this stuff, and I think this is around time I was actually beta testing the game, but I didn't want to like say too much at the time because it's not like I signed an NDA or anything like that. But I kind of figured, it's in beta. Let's not talk too much about it. Let's kind of give them time to change things. Now, the game at the time was slated to be released at the beginning of this year, which didn't happen, obviously, right? So obviously it's been pushed back. They didn't announce that it was pushed back, but I mean, it's not Q1 2024 anymore. Now, how far back this is going to be pushed back, don't know. I'm assuming maybe the end of the year, maybe to push it back to next year. We'll see what happens, right? Of course, it was just put out there recently that the Flying Kick is consulting them or whatever. I don't really think that this is going to help that much because, again, one of the reasons why I stopped testing in the first place was because the open beta was an absolute mess. And I'm not talking about the game, I'm talking about the way that they did it. They had just a bunch of people jumping into their Discord to beta test and stuff. Opinions all over the place. Nobody's really talking about the actual issues with the game. I brought up a number of issues that I thought about the game when I first tested it. Things that are still in this beta or this demo, right? This demo still feels the same. The beta that we tested had different characters and stuff than what's in the demo. But I'm gonna be honest, even those characters just didn't they didn't make the game better. But I want to talk about my impressions. After playing the demo, I thought maybe the demo would be a little bit different than what I tested. It wasn't. There were some things that were kind of changed up and made it a little bit better. This is just going to be a video of me just crapping all over the game because there are certain aspects of it that I do think are good, right? But the first thing I want to talk about is the kind of the game plan of this project. Look, the first thing I typically ask whenever I'm being consulted or whatever I'm going to beta test something, I'm going to give my feedback on it, is what is the developer's game plan? What is your plan of action? What kind of give me an elevator pitch of what you're going for. The reason I ask this is because I don't want to impose my ideas on the developer if that's not the direction they want to go. Now, look, if you want to work on a game that is, for example, a Final Fight clone, I'm not going to suggest things that's going to make the game play like a Shredder's Revenge or make it play like Jitsu Squad or something like that, because it's not what you're going for. You're going for a more Final Fight, more grounded game, right? Well, when I asked this, there wasn't really a straightforward answer. It was just kind of all over the place, and it kind of really just boiled down to I want to make a beat 'em up, and I mean, fair enough, I guess, but that's problematic when it comes down to like something like this, right? If I'm gonna make an elevator pitch for GI Joe, right? Somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, Mr.Din, we want you to make a GI Joe game," and they want me to kind of prove that I got the chops to do this, right? I've already said it in the last video. I've talked about it in the last video. You guys can already watch that, check that out, whatever. But the first thing I'm going to say, my elevator pitch is going to be, all right, I'm going to make a G.I. Joe beat 'em up, right? This is already a hard sell anyway, because most people have already, my first thought was, is this going to work? Is G.I. Joe going to work as a beat 'em up, right? But if I'm going to do an elevator pitch for a G.I. Joe game, and I'm coming in, I'm going to work on a G.I. Joe beat 'em up. First thing I'm going to say is, it's going to be Alien vs. Predator arcade meets Punisher arcade. That's the core element that I'm going for, right? So that there's not... So to me, it's not going to be enemies bouncing off walls and all this other crazy stuff, right? Because to me, G.I. Joe, and this could be my bias as somebody who came up on like the 2000s version of GI Joe. I did watch the classic one too, right? Even before that reboot came out. But I was like a kid when I watched that. When I was like got older, I watched the reboot that didn't last that long, but it was a pretty cool show, right? But GI Joe to me does not come off as like and I think that's the problem with this game too. Um Actually no, before I get to that, I'm gonna say this, right? The elevator pitch that I get off the current GI Joe, Wrath of Cobra, right, is GI Joe, but Shredder's Revenge. That's what I'm getting, right. Getting back to that point, when I think of GI Joe, I don't think of stuff like enemies bouncing off the walls and there being invisible walls and you doing dive kicks and all this other stuff, right? Granted, if you're playing a Snake Eyes, maybe, right? Maybe other characters would have something like that or whatever. But honestly, I think Aliens versus Predator, or more, if we want to go like more classic, right? I think of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs or Punisher, right? That's the first thing I'm thinking. That there's gonna be a lot of ground combat. There's gonna be some gunplay. There's gonna be some weapons and stuff like that. You're gonna have that stuff going. And to its credit, this game does have that. It does have gunplay, right? It does have melee combat and stuff like that. And even the string clear moves are kind of cool, right? But again, it comes off as like more of a Shredder's Revenge kind of thing where there's this frantic movement and enemies are bouncing all over the place. You're jumping all over the place and stuff like that. And it just doesn't feel right for a G.I. Joe game, right? Now, getting into the gameplay of this, like I said, the demo didn't really change much from what I've already beta tested. But one of the biggest problems that I have, and this is why I ask these questions. What is your game plan? Is that this game just doesn't feel like it has any cohesive idea of what it's gonna be, right? On the surface, you look at it and you see, oh, they're trying to do a Shredder's Revenge kind of thing with this game, right? And that makes sense, right? It makes sense for you to think that when you see it. But then you get into something like the control scheme, and what you have is another absolute mess of buttons that aren't necessary for a game that's kind of simplistic like Shredder's Revenge. You have two attack buttons, right? You have a block button that parries when you time it, right? And then you got two other buttons that don't currently work right now. You have the grab button. Oh no, the grab button is work. And then you have the run button, right? And then of course you have the special move, right? That makes 6 buttons. That's 6 buttons, 6 primary buttons, right? Or you know what? I would probably say the run is not a primary button. So 5 primary buttons, right? Your 2 attacks, light and heavy. Of course, your jump is always going to be primary button. Block, and then your special move, right? And then there's 2 additional secondary, which would be your taunt, and then the run trigger. Now, you have all these things, but the game does not play with any type of depth that would require 2 attack buttons. Really, to be honest with you, the block button is even needed here. Like, and that's just me being straightforward. Like, I actually feel like the block button is overpowered. You probably see it in that clip that I posted where he's blocking the laser from the car. Now, you could probably say, well, why not just make it where certain things can't be blocked? Well, you have a parry, right? And you don't... This game does not feel like you need a parry in it, right? Honestly, even something with the depth that Streets of Rage 4 has doesn't need a parry. Like, people were saying that they should add a parry to it, right? And I disagreed with them because I felt like, well, you got your special moves and stuff in Streets of Rage 4, it's fine, right? But I could see a parry being added to that due to certain ways that the enemies attack you and stuff like that. I could see a parry button working in that. But even in a game like that, you don't really need parries, right? So a game like this, you definitely don't need parries, right? It just seems like something that was just kind of added because it's a cool thing to add, right? Same thing with the wall bouncing and the invisible walls and stuff like that. I'm gonna assume that stuff was suggested by Guard Crush Games because Guard Crush is like being consulted as well. Honestly, man, look, the game is being consulted by Guard Crush Games and now the Flying Kick, and I still don't think it's gonna really turn out as good as it should be. That's just me. That's just me saying that, right? Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know, but yeah, no parry. The game doesn't need parry. You could just get rid of that. The run trigger doesn't even work right now, but I honestly think they should just not waste their time with that because they already have double tap to run, and that works fine. There's no reason to have run trigger. It's just why, right? The running attacks um don't even really have a lot of use. So like there's no dire need for there to be two different versions of run because running doesn't really feel like a mechanic that you would actually use in this game often outside of getting from one place to the other. So I think they should just not waste their time with that. The grab button, I'm not even sure because again, I don't. Uh, when I was testing, I didn't understand. I don't know what direction they're trying to go with this, and it feels like they just added the grab button because people said, "Hey, this game doesn't have any grabs in it." And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't really feel like this game needs to have grabs. If I'm gonna be honest, right? I can't even like. It definitely did. I don't. I definitely don't think it needs a grab button, right? Currently, the attack button picks up weapons. It even picks up enemies off the floor. So they do have a They have some kind of grapple mechanic where you're picking enemies off the floor and throwing them, right? Which a little weird for a GI Joe game, but whatever. That's fine. I actually think that's actually a mechanic that I like. In this game, right? I also think the weapons are pretty good, right? They updated the weapons a bit, and I think the weapons are pretty good. They shoot a little too fast, right? I think there needs to be some kind of recoil, some kind of like reload mechanics, something, right, to not make them so overpowered. I also think the enemies when they have weapons, they should drop them when you knock them down. I don't know why that's not a thing yet, but they should do that. But yeah, I think the weapons are pretty decent. Actually, it just needs like some at least some fine tuning so that it's not overpowered. Um, but that's actually just a lot of things in this game in general, like need that need fine tuning. Like the jumping is still extremely weird. I can't even. It's not floaty. Like you jump and then you stop and then you fall, and it's like what? Like I'm gonna be honest. I have never seen this in a beat 'em before. I've never seen that. I've seen jumps being kind of janky, floaty, or sometimes too heavy. Right? I've never seen a jump where you jump, you stop, and then you fall. It's very weird, very strange, right? Um, and speaking of that, going into like the two attack buttons again, like overtly complex thing in a game that's clearly not complex, right? I think they just need to remove it. I suggested that this was like a day one. I first played the beta and it was like, no, get rid of the second button, right? And like, this is again, this is why I said the whole beta test thing was a mess. Because like, look, if the developers didn't take my advice, I don't care. That doesn't matter. I'm just putting the advice out there, right? You take it or not, it's fine. What was crazy to me though is that I go in there and I'm giving these things. I'm trying to figure out like what direction you guys trying to take this, right? And I'm saying like, hey, you guys don't need a second button. And I was like getting all this pushback, like for saying stuff like they don't need the heavy button and stuff like that. And like what it reminded me of was like I think when I first beta tested Mayhem Brawler, like the developers were saying like, hey, like people are not hardcore players like you guys, right? And I always find that to be strange because I'm like I don't really consider myself to be a hardcore player, right? Like I'm like above casual, I guess, right? I have a love for the genre and stuff, but like I'm not that good at these games, you know. Um, but I was getting all this pushback as if like I was saying something crazy when I'm like, no, like what? And I think that's why the whole beta test was a mess. Because as I said, I don't care one way or the other if the developer doesn't take my advice or whatever. But like when you have so many differing opinions, and a lot of the people are just GI Joe fans, they don't play beat 'em ups, not beat 'em up fans. They probably played Final Fight once in their life, right? Some of them don't even like know. Like they're just as confused about GI Joe being a beat 'em up than anybody else, right? And these people are giving me pushback. Like, why are you suggesting that they remove a mechanic? It's like because the mechanic is pretty much useless. Because right now, what the second button does, the heavy button, um, it it kind of has a bit of a special property depending on the character that you use. Right? They have their different unique attack, right? But it doesn't really do anything. Like it doesn't do anything that you putting it as a charge attack or something else in the moveset could do. Right? You could literally put these things into like just the regular attack button, but with like an input or something, right? But what heavy does right now at the moment has the default attack, which is very often like you know for Duke for example, it's just a kick, and all it does is knock enemies in the air a little bit, right? Doesn't really do anything, right? You have the running attack, you have the running heavy attack, right? And this is something that kind of changes and varies between the different characters and stuff like that. Duke has this running double kick thing that he does, and then that kind of has a property to it that knocks enemies against the wall and stuff like that. Um, and then I think let's see, what was it? There was like a third attack. I'm trying to think here. Third attack with heavy. I don't fully recall here what it was. I want to say a jump attack, but for Duke it doesn't do that. Like his jump attack is a dive kick no matter what, right? And this is the problem with adding a secondary attack button. You really have to plan around that. Like listen, I'm telling you right now, as somebody who is developing a game, okay, I thought about adding a second attack button, right, to my project, and ultimately, because the programmer straight up told me like, look, you don't need a second attack button, right? He made it very clear, like, and I listened. I listened when he said that because I was sitting there thinking about it. I'm like, yeah, I do actually have to account for a lot of things if I add the secondary attack button. And that's the problem with this game. The heavy attack button has like what 2 or 3 different functions, right? But doesn't account for anything else, right? It also picks up items for some reason. It also picks up enemies for some reason, which the light button does. So it's not even something that's unique to that button, right? Um, so there isn't really a lot of use for the heavy attack button. And I've said this like, dude, just get rid of the heavy attack button and take those other animations and stuff like that. Make them like a special move, like a special input or something like that. Like, um, Snake Eyes has this like running, spinning blade attack that's like insane. Like it's the same move. Like it's extremely overpowered, right? I don't know, I don't know if they were fixing it because when they updated the beta, he wasn't in there anymore for some reason. This was in the beta, not the demo, right? But yeah, he had this overpowered move, and I was like, that could just be an input. Like that could be like I don't know, put a down forward attack or something like that. It doesn't have to be a running heavy, right? Um, but yeah, just the second attack button, parries, like all this other stuff is just a bunch of stuff that's like overly complex for a game that doesn't call for it at the moment. Um, Parry and block, as I said before, is extremely overpowered. You you can block anything, right? I played against the boss and I blocked most like Baroness and I blocked most of her attack. And I think the only reason she hit me is because she moves forward, and I think she hit me from like behind because she got past me at some point. I think it's the only reason she hit me. But I could also assume maybe that after a certain amount of attacks, it actually breaks through or whatever. But to top it off, that same button you can parry with, and the parry's very lenient, right? And this is what I mean. Like, take a game like Fight Rage, for example, right? Fight Rage is not a complex game. You know, you don't have complex combos and stuff like that. You have three buttons: your attack, your jump, and your special move. You have three buttons. That's it. There's nothing else, right? One of the greatest beat 'em ups of all time. Simple, straightforward. It has parries in it, right? But the parry is helpful in the fact that the enemies are insanely aggressive, right? And they have moves that require you to like really think about what you're doing. Oh yeah, it also has vertical dodging stuff like that, right? But these enemies keep you on your toes. I don't feel like that in this game at all. Enemies come off of one side or the other side of the screen or whatever. They just kind of walk in and then maybe they'll attack you, maybe they won't, right? Um, yeah, and things feel off with that too. Sometimes like they'll have a gun, so you kind of have to try to catch up to them and stuff. But like for the most part, like the parry. Oh, that's the other thing about the parry. So the other thing about the parry in this game is that if you time it right, right, it follows up with a counter. So it's not just a parry; it's also a counter, right? And again, in a game as complex as like I don't know, Streets Rage 4. Honestly, like this, geez, like I can't. Streets Rage 4, maybe Fighting Rage, right? Again, Fighting Rage is not complex, but the the mechanics feel deep enough, right? You could kind of see something like that, right? Maiden Brawler has a block and a counter, right? But it's not a parry; it's a counter. You have to block first, and then you have to time your attack so you do a counter, right? There's an extra input in between here. It's not both, right? And this is what I mean by developers just tossing things in their game just because it's cool and not really planning for them. This game has a bunch of mechanics that just why are they there? You know? I don't know what else to say is in regards to my thoughts on this though. Um like I said, the demo is rough and you guys actually have context to play it now, right? Um yeah.